Rania Khalek is a journalist extraordinaire, host of Dispatches on Breakthrough News, and a very popular guest of ours. Rania, welcome. The point I was making earlier was that it turned out the only red lines around Rafah were the rivers of blood. I'm right, haven't I?
Yeah, George, it's really horrific what we're witnessing. Over 1 million people sheltering in Rafah, told to go there for safety. Over 600,000 of them are children, and they've been subjected to bombings all this time, but just not as much as the rest of Gaza. And now Israel's unleashing its fury on Rafah. You've had this theatrical performance by the Biden administration saying, oh no, please don't go into Rafah. Oh no, please don't go into Rafah. Only to then make little threats that are mostly symbolic. I mean, we did see the Biden administration put on hold one weapons shipments, but the other weapons shipments are still going through. It's insane. It seems like no one can stop Israel. If ever there was a case to be made for humanitarian intervention, which I've never agreed with when it comes from the U.S., because the U.S. is always arguing for humanitarian intervention just to go in and steal resources and overthrow governments that it doesn't like. But in this case, it's needed. I mean, Israel needs to be stopped. This unfolding slaughter has been going on for 7 months, just relentless genocide. And you still have people, I mean, it's shocking, George. You still have people in mainstream media on whether it's the BBC or CNN or MSNBC or the New York Times going and defending this disgusting slaughter. At this point, it has been 7 months. We are 7 months into this. Either you are pro-genocide or you're against genocide. There's no in between anymore. There's no conversation to be had anymore. There's no debate to be had anymore. And it's utterly frightening that the most powerful people in the world are showing us that they're happy to shred the bodies of tens of thousands of babies in Gaza for the sake of imperialism.
It is, and the excuse given, I've never accepted it myself, was that the death camps of the Holocaust, that the West didn't know what was happening in these death camps. Otherwise, they would have bombed them and destroyed them. They would have destroyed the railways that took the cattle trucks full of Jewish people to their slaughter. They claimed that they didn't know that, in fact, when the death camps were liberated by the Red Army overwhelmingly, that it all came as a big shock to them, even though the beast of Berlin, Hitler, had written it all down in advance. None of them can claim this now. No one can say, no one in the world can say, they did not know what Israel was doing in the death camp of Gaza. That's a very, very dangerous, difficult position for all these journalists and politicians now to be in, isn't it?
It is. And, you know, just to reiterate what you're saying about World War II, the U.S. did know, and they were asked to bomb those railways, and they refused to. They couldn't be bothered to bomb the railways that were taking Jews to death camps to be slaughtered on an industrial scale. We also have to remember that the U.S. and U.K. leadership, before the Nazis started taking large parts of Europe, were very supportive of the Nazis because they saw them as the strongest bulwark against communism, which they always saw as the greater enemy. And also, let's not forget what the Nazis did in the Holocaust was actually taking many lessons from what European powers, from what the American government has always done to the global South. So it was, you know, kind of like inverted colonialism, or colonialism turned inward. But to bring it to today, absolutely. Nobody can deny that they don't see what they can't say. They don't see what's happening in Gaza right now. It's being live streamed for everyone to see. The images of children, the images of families on the run, the starvation, the people in hospitals. I mean, now we have these mass graves, hundreds of people executed summarily by the Israelis at Al-Shifa and Nasser Hospital, including doctors and patients. I mean, the evidence is there. Gaza is one giant crime scene for genocide. And they all know exactly what's happening, and they're trying to deny it. And you know, George, there's nothing more disgusting to me than people who wrap themselves in one genocide, being the Holocaust, in order to justify another one in Gaza. It is so sick. And it's what we're seeing in the US right now, with not just, invoking the Holocaust to justify killing as many civilians as they want to in Gaza, but also using the idea of the threat, or, this issue of anti-Semitism to shut down these pro-Palestine protests across campuses. It's incredibly alarming, and I don't think we've ever experienced this. Unprecedented. I don't think we've ever seen another time in history that we can point to where one genocide and one form of bigotry was used to justify the wholesale slaughter of children in another part of the world.
I think we have not seen it, and we'll come back to it. Let me stay with the Philadelphia corridor for a moment, Rania. I made the point earlier, maybe minor one compared to the other breaches of international law, which are manifestly being live streamed right now. But it is part of the Camp David Accord that there will be no Israeli military presence on the Rafah border with Egypt. I think 1 kilometer or 5 kilometers even is the nearest the Israeli army has ever been allowed to go. Thus, the Camp David Accords have been broken. That is an international treaty, again guaranteed, this time by the United States and the UN Security Council. Egypt's sovereignty has been egregiously violated. Is anyone bothered about that, even in Cairo?
I mean, I think there's certainly people who are bothered, but there are people in power in these normalizing states that are more bothered because they worry about what it means internally for their own populations that might get very angry about Israel's behavior and what it could mean for them and their hold on power. These countries like Egypt and Jordan and the Gulf states that have normalized with Israel, they haven't normalized with Israel because their populations love Israel. Their populations despise Israel. They've normalized because they've been cajoled and bullied and bought off and bribed into doing it. And that's why Israel has these treaties with the Egyptians and the Jordanians. And, we're not going to see the leadership in these countries care so much or do much about it, because at the end of the day, they rely on the U.S. to keep their monarchies and their dictatorships in power. And as long as the U.S. can guarantee their power, they're all in. And until there becomes some sort of internal threat of perhaps revolutionary spirit among their own people, or where they can't control their own population anymore, you're not going to see a change. You're just going to see empty words, which is what we've seen from these countries since the beginning, even with the more forceful words we've heard from, for example, the Jordanian royal family. That doesn't mean anything when you are still actively trading with the Israelis, helping them with their so-called security. In other words, helping them, oppress Palestinians, and assisting them in the case of Jordan with blocking Iranian missiles that are headed towards Israel. And everyone in the region's angry about this. It's just, the U.S. has created a very successful system of control across the region to make sure that nobody can do anything about it. But I will also point out that in other countries, we do have people doing something about it. We have people in Lebanon. You have Hezbollah doing something about it. You have the Iraqi resistance doing something about it, and those in Syria as well. And you have the Yemenis doing something about it, as well as the Iranians. And so this is the situation we're in right now, where it's not the Middle East of 2003. It's the Middle East of 2024, where there actually is an axis of resistance that is able to put up a fight against Israel and against America. And that includes the brave Palestinians operating out of a death camp in Gaza every single day, fighting for their survival.
On that subject, Netanyahu, by any metric, has dismally failed in this operation. If the stated purposes of the operation were the true ones. So, for example, he said it was to free the hostages, even though the hostages could have been freed on day one with an all-for-all prisoner exchange, all hostages for all Palestinian hostages. But a very large number of those hostages must have now been killed by Israeli bombing. And the massacres currently taking place may very well end up also massacring the remaining survivors amongst those Israeli hostages. Number two, it was to destroy the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. But just this day, more than 50 Israeli soldiers have been medevaced, seriously wounded, inside Gaza, meaning that the resistance is still fighting, and still fighting with a great deal of success against the invading Israeli armies. And of course, if the stated purpose was to win more friends for Israel across the world, well, that's the most spectacular fail of all, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, just a couple of things you said there. One about the hostages. I mean, Israel doesn't care about their hostages. The only hostages who've been killed have been killed by the Israelis, whether it's them using the Hannibal Directive to try to stop people from being taken as hostages, because they prefer to kill their own people than to allow them to be taken as hostages and used as leverage to release Palestinian hostages. But moreover, the Israelis killed their own hostages when they thought they were Palestinians fleeing. My outlet Breakthrough News did a tally of all of the ceasefire proposals that Hamas has agreed to. We counted 10 since October 7th, and many of them were immediately after October 7th. Hamas said, we will release these hostages in exchange for all of the Palestinian hostages that you are holding. Let's not forget there are 10,000 Palestinians being held by the Israelis hostage. They are prisoners. And Israel repeatedly said, no. There was that one brief period in November where there was a week-long pause where they said yes, and there was prisoner exchanges. But other than that, even now, the Israeli government is the problem. They're the ones who keep saying no to Hamas, saying we will give you your hostages back in exchange for this and a ceasefire. So the problem is the Israelis. They don't want their hostages. They don't care about them. That's all a smokescreen. Destroying Hamas is a smokescreen. The Israelis aren't stupid. They know they can't destroy Hamas. 7 months into this genocide, they have yet to militarily defeat the Palestinian resistance groups, again, operating out of a death camp. They can't defeat resistance groups operating out of a death camp. If you can't defeat them in these horrifying circumstances, you're never going to be able to defeat them. And they know that. This is all about grabbing as much land as possible and getting rid of as much Palestinians as possible, which has always been Israel's reason for existing. And it shows you what an existential crisis Israel is in, because it has isolated itself around the world. And this is really the beginning of the end of the Zionist project, in the sense that it's not sustainable. It is not sustainable to continue to slaughter and genocide people when there's cameras everywhere. It's just not in the long run. The question then becomes, how many people are going to be killed in the process? Because Israel's not going to go down without a fight, and it's going to take a lot of people down with it. And it's the greatest threat to the security of the region for that reason.
Let's bring it back then finally to the United States. Biden's now damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. Having facilitated, more than facilitated, having collaborated with the massacre and maiming of tens of thousands of Palestinian women and children, he pays the political price for that. Now, with Trump trying to outdo him as Zion Don, he begins to feign discomfort at the level of the slaughter and the impudence of Netanyahu rejecting his so-called red lines. And he actually loses such support as he might have had from amongst the pro-Israel fanatics in the United States, most of whom, of course, are Christians. It never should be forgotten. His goose is cooked, isn't it? Biden is finished.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see how Biden survives this politically. Just if you look at what's taking place across the country, you know, America calls itself a democracy, but really only a handful of states matter in the presidential election. And one of those states is Michigan. It has a huge Arab American population, many Palestinians, many Lebanese. And I'm not saying all of those people are going to sit this one out, but a lot of them are going to sit this one out, and they're not going to vote for Joe Biden. After you've slaughtered people's families and demonstrated how little you care about Arabs, how much you really just don't see them as human when you've completely allied yourself with the Israeli government that's calling them, human animals. People aren't going to vote for that. I know many members of my family, even some who aren't that political, find this behavior disgusting, and they can't vote for someone who's genocided people. He also has the problem of young people. I mean, look what he's done across the country. We have this massive uprising across campuses, across universities in America, where young people are saying they're sick of their tuition dollars being invested in a genocide, in Israel's military occupation, and moreover, in America's military industrial complex. And for having these encampments, these very peaceful encampments, with Palestinian flags and saying not in our name, not with our money, they were met across the country with riot police, tear gassing them, firing rubber bullets at them, beating them with batons, and arresting them. Over 2,500 students and others arrested across the country for protesting genocide and smeared as anti-Semites by the president himself. So young people, that's the worst way to try to inspire young people to come out and vote for you. So yeah, I think Biden is politically toast. And when he does lose the election, he's going to blame it on Arabs and young people for getting Trump elected. But it's his fault. He can't win that game. He can't win this game where on the one hand, he wants to be the hardcore Israel supporter who puts police on students and kills babies in Gaza, while on the other hand, trying to be soft when Trump is going to outdo him. His advisors are idiots, and they'll go down in history probably as the worst political consultants ever. But of course, they'll keep being hired and they'll keep making money because they never learn from their mistakes. It's 2016 all over again, but on steroids.
Rania Khalek, superstar, thanks for joining us.